which is what we're doing now, making the soft political decisions. And when you make the soft political decisions, it ultimately is a wrong decision. The ECB is a good example. You know, they said, okay, we're not going to buy any bonds, but then all of a sudden they start buying Greek bonds. Once you bought Greek bonds, then, you know, okay, well, we bought the Greek bonds. How can we not buy the Irish bonds? Let's buy some Portuguese bonds. Now they're buying Italian bonds and Spanish bonds. Where's it stop?
It stops when it just fundamentally breaks and doesn't work anymore. And when that happens, I think it's a very painful place to be. It's enough of a chance now that when I say a painful break, I mean the ECB is buying, but they're buying at a kind of a tepid rate. They bought the Italian bonds. It's a real instructive piece here. So Italian bonds shoot past 6%. The ECB stepping in large, letting everybody know about it. They're buying. They bring the rates back down under 6 for a while. Then rates creep up again. ECB's back in there. The danger here is that the ECB is revealed to be a paper tiger. And the market is already betting against that by driving Italian yields now back up north of 7% again. And so at some point, that perception shift we talked about, the market suddenly says, the ECB is not up to this task, can't do it. And the ECB gets completely swamped by actual market events.
Maybe we're almost there. I mean, 7% is the threshold. When Greece went over the cliff, Greece went over the cliff, Ireland went over the cliff. We're 7% now in Italy. ECB's accumulated, last time I looked, 183 billion euros worth of government bonds from the various Mediterraneans and Ireland. Isn't that sort of suggesting that, you know, the market doesn't believe the ECB, or basically the market is saying that, gosh, if the ECB is going to make a market for me and buy these bonds, I better get rid of these bonds quickly and, you know, buy farmland?
Well, the market is saying the ECB's efforts are insufficient. And so when you look at what the Federal Reserve did, you know, when they decided to step in and start supporting treasuries, that program was $600 billion nominal, but actually became larger because they were using MBS rollover. So that program was about $800 billion just to support U.S. Treasury obligations. Both markets roughly comparable. And so if the ECB is going to be at all taken seriously in this, I think they're going to have to take that program and multiply it by some whole number, 4, 5.
But the difference is that in Europe, the EU treaty does not allow the bailout of other countries.
Rules.
And it doesn't allow the ECB, you know, to buy government bonds, and they're breaking the rules. So I mean, you can't really compare it to the Federal Reserve, can you?
No, but the rules are made to be broken. I can't. The rules that have been broken in this crisis are stunning so far. Stunning things. The Federal Reserve has done things they are not supposed to do, and it hasn't stopped them, right? And even if there was a rule that would stop them, they would just use a proxy agent.
But this is what has the Germans so irate, because the Bundesbank had these rules. They followed the rules religiously for 50 years. They made the hard decisions that needed to be made. They remained independent of the political process. And the Deutschmark in 2000 had basically the same purchasing power that a Deutschmark did back in 1950. Compare that 50-year experience to the French franc or any other European currency. You know, it was far, far better than any other European currency. To get Germany into the EU, they had to say, okay, we're going to take the Bundesbank rules and we're going to follow them. All of these rules are being broken. Is it a wonder that the German people are irate, that all of these promises have been broken, that the rules have been broken?
No, it's particularly, I mean, the German people love the rules, and those rules served them very, very well. So, you know, once upon a time, you know, when we read history books from maybe 1800s, 1900s, people took economics seriously. They took their money seriously. They understood that you couldn't just trust someone to manage that for you, because if that trust often would get misplaced and misused. So here we are in a situation where most people have taken their eye off the ball, decided that economics is too complicated and that I can't understand monetary policy and history and all that stuff. And it's absolutely false. It's a very easy equation. Are we printing more money than we have actual goods and services being created or not? It couldn't be any simpler than that. And the answer is we've been creating money and money equivalents at far higher rates than can be supported by any analysis of the economy. And that even includes the idea that the economy itself, we're mismeasuring it and we're reporting it as more robust than it is, and we're including all kinds of fraudulent statistical tricks in there, these imputations, hedonics, all kinds of crazy stuff. The true economy underneath everything, which has to come from the actual production of goods and services, which has to come from the natural bounty of the earth. All of those things are actually in depletion at this point, and we're looking at a world of scarcity. This is a really incredible period of time to be alive. Immense things are happening over this next decade or two that have never happened before.
Yeah. what you were talking about was sort of interesting in the sense that you're also alluding to the fact that there's a lack of education out there today. That because people don't understand what money is and how they have to protect and save for their future, they've come to rely on government promises, and that in turn is sort of fed on this bigger bubble that we're in. That people actually believe what politicians say.
Yeah, well, it's an intriguing thing, but it's true. And so I discovered something really important about 4 years ago. I came across this insight, which was that I wasn't in the business of sharing information. Oh, that's what I do. The book is full of information, and I use facts as much as possible. But I discovered that facts weren't swaying a lot of opinions out there. And what I discovered was I wasn't in the business of sharing information. I was actually in the business of challenging beliefs. So somebody has a belief, a faith, that the government will solve problems. Facts aren't going to dissuade them from that. We have to actually go at the belief that sits there. So I've discovered that instead of talking about more and more facts, what I'll do is I'll talk instead about the ability of government and the limitations and past experiences of when governments, what they can and what they can't do. That's where the conversation has to start, with somebody who holds a faith that government can solve the problems, right? And it has nothing to do with facts at this point. Whenever the government spends, eventually, sooner or later, the taxpayer pays for it, right? You either pay for it by paying the debts back, or you pay for it in the form of inflation. But I think you're right, there is this disconnect. Some people think that somehow the government can spend money that we don't have to pay back. And it's been true for a long time because we've just accumulated debts constantly, right? With the idea that that could go on forever. That's a false idea, and eventually you can't increase your debts forever. And that's the world we're in. We're in the early stage of breaking a 40-year-old paradigm which says we can just expand deficits forever, debts forever. It doesn't matter, because the growth will always be there to support whatever level of debt we decide to create. Yeah. And that's the actual biggest underlying part of this is where the narrative is breaking down at a very fundamental level, is that the old layers of growth we could depend on, 3, 4, 5% economic growth. We can't achieve that anymore. We might have to figure out how to live in a world of 1%, 2%, God forbid, 0% growth. And that's such a different operating environment. Our institutions aren't geared for it. Our political systems, our ways of thinking, our culture, all kinds of things are not ready for that world. And that's the world that I see we've kind of tipped into, is this low growth world where literally all of our old assumptions have to be taken out, dusted off, examined, many of them trashed. And it's literally a giant paradigm shift.
Yeah.
And
it's being tested throughout the world.
Everywhere.
Because the entire world has adopted this system that is geared toward growth and consuming resources and everything else, but the growth isn't happening anywhere because everywhere basically things are over-leveraged. Even the Chinese growth, it's come from a small base, and one has to question the reliability of the Chinese government numbers, but even there, it's built on a massive debt in the sense that they've got cities now that are empty, apartment complexes that are empty, shopping centers that are empty, just a terrible misallocation of capital and resources.
Yeah, China's an interesting story. I think they're late to the game. They're trying to recreate an entire Western civilization in basically a single generation. And they're doing it by our model, which is we're going to build shopping malls, we're going to base it around consumption, it's going to be automobile-centric, so it's going to require all the basic things, food, fuel, concrete, steel, usual stuff. And that makes sense on one level, but on another level, when you look at where we are in the global resource story, you would say, that's not how, that wouldn't be the smartest way to go about this at this point. I think that the future belongs to those companies, those countries, those individuals who can find a way to do more with less, who can actually have real, solid, fundamental economic growth based on the resources they actually have access to. And access to resources is clearly, it's a game that's been played kind of quietly out of sight for the past almost 10 years now. China very quietly out there with its magic checkbook, buying stuff in Africa and South America, all over the place, wherever they can find it. The United States assuming, I think with NATO, making the assumption that gunboat diplomacy is how we're going to maintain our access to these things. So two sort of different policies, all though triangulating on this idea that 7 billion people on the planet now, just crossed that threshold, on our way to 9 billion, pretty much no matter what happens. The amount of arable land per capita, energy per capita, timber per capita, all of these things have nosed over, not recently, but a decade or more ago. And so now there's going to be, which society is best structured to do the most on a per capita basis. And those are the investments we should have been making, is around how do we become more efficient with our resources. And some countries are better positioned than others, and I think Europe actually is better positioned than the United States, using half the energy per capita. The United States actually has a giant Achilles heel in that particular zone, but many of the so-called developing nations are way better positioned than any of the OECD countries because they were late to the game too. They didn't have the capital there to really exploit their resources. So guess what? Brazil now has more natural resources left, in the ground, ready to be used and by their society than the United States does. I think resource conflicts are inevitable. And we might say that the first resource conflicts are going to be financial in nature. And I think we've already seen those where China tried to buy Unocal, which actually has a lot of oil assets in the Asian area, and was prevented by Congress. U.S. Congress was against that idea. But now we see China out there buying things and outcompeting Western societies for resources, just outbidding them for all kinds of things. That to me is going to be the first layer of this conflict. And as that dials up, we'll see the usual things. We'll see trade wars erupt, or people will be tagged as currency manipulators, so the usual financial shenanigans. My worry is that this will progress into something a little bit more substantial, something more severe at some point. And here we have to note that everything that's going on in the Middle East, when we look at all the policy that's happened, what's happening with the saber rattling around Iran right now, but what happened with Iraq, if we say, maybe these things aren't about weapons of mass destruction or nuclear devices or whatever the reason du jour happens to be, and we say, where's the oil? That's where all the oil that's exploitable, that's where the easy to find, very high flow rate reservoirs, that's where all the good ones are left. Mm-hmm. And in this story we say, well, the United States has a sea route to go over there and attempt to maintain its presence and hold on those assets, and China has a land route. History is also clear on this. If you have a land route, you have an advantage in this particular story, especially when it comes to something like oil, which, by the way, to take it by the sea route, you have to put it into these very large crude carriers, and you got to sail it at about 12 knots through the Strait of Hormuz and 12,000 miles to a refinery. Those things are big, slow, explosive sort of things.
Targets.
Yeah, targets. And so in this story, I think we'll find out that having access to is going to be a very important dynamic as we see the future unfold.